I did not leave my hometown because I wanted a better life. I left because my sister was born with a third eye, and the town decided she should never be allowed to grow up. Years later, when her body was pulled from the river, that eye was no longer there. No one ever admitted taking it, but the people who needed it most were still alive, still powerful, and still paying very close attention to me. I only started telling this story after I had been gone long enough to believe I was safe from it. I thought time would dry out the memories, the way mud dries on boots, the way smoke fades from hair. But some things do not fade, they settle deeper, and when life gets quiet enough, you can feel them watching from inside your own head. There are nights when I wake up and know someone is standing close to my bed. I do not hear breathing or footsteps or a door opening. I only feel a tension, steady and patient, like a hand held inches from skin without ever touching. My hometown was the kind of place that acted friendly because it had nothing else to sell. A river cut through the edge of it, slow in summer, swollen in winter, always darker than it should have been. People said the river was deep, but what they really meant was that it kept what it took. My sister was born during a storm that made adults whisper. Thunder hit close enough to rattle windows, and lightning flashed so often that the room looked like a broken film reel. My mother said my sister barely cried, she only stared upward, calm in a way that felt wrong for a newborn. Between her eyebrows there was a narrow crease, like a hairline crack in porcelain. At first it looked like a birthmark, something the family could explain away if they tried. But when lightning struck and light spilled through the curtains, that crease caught it like glass, then opened. It was an eye, small but complete, set in the center of her forehead. It stared without blinking, without curiosity, without fear. It looked like it had already seen too much and decided feelings were no longer useful. My father was not a superstitious man until that night. He believed in hard work, in drought, in debt, in the kind of bad luck you could measure in empty fields. But he had also grown up hearing stories about animals with horizontal pupils, and what it meant when something watched you without emotion. The town had its own version of those stories. They said goats were born with eyes like that because goats were not meant to be trusted. They said if a creature like that stared at you long enough, something inside you would crack and you would never quite be whole again. When my father saw that eye open in my sister's forehead, the stories stopped being stories. He did not shout or pray or ask for help. He went quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they decide something they will later call necessary. Before sunrise he wrapped her in a feed sack and carried her toward the river. My mother followed, crying in the dark, but her crying stayed small and contained, like she feared even sound would invite consequences. The storm had softened to rain, and the river looked black and heavy, like oil moving slowly. My father stepped to the edge, and I have been told my sister did not even struggle. My mother said the sack in his arms was still, like my sister already understood that pleading never worked on fear. Then the old midwife appeared behind them, barefoot in the mud, breathless, her hair soaked flat against her skull. She did not beg my father with tenderness, she begged him with terror. She told him that if he drowned the child, the town would not be rid of the thing they feared. She said fear does not die when you feed it blood, it learns the taste, then comes back hungry. My father turned around and carried the sack home. He never admitted the midwife had frightened him, but my mother said his hands shook for hours afterward. From that day on, my sister was treated like a mistake that needed to be hidden from neighbors and from God. They kept her in an old pig shed behind our house. It had a low roof, warped boards, and a smell that never left even after the animals were gone. My mother would carry food to her, then wash her hands hard afterward, like guilt was something you could scrub away. When my sister was old enough to speak, she spoke very little. She learned early that words made people look at her longer, and being looked at was never safe. She spent most days sitting still, as if stillness might make her invisible. The town pretended not to know she was there. But they knew because towns like that always know what is happening behind every fence. Sometimes I think pretending was part of the cruelty because it allowed them to claim innocence while still enjoying the fear. I was born a few years after my sister, healthy and ordinary. My father treated me like an answer, proof that God had corrected an error. Neighbors pinched my cheeks and said I was lucky, then their eyes drifted toward the backyard, toward the shed they would never mention. As I grew up, I learned the rules without being taught. Do not point at the shed, do not ask questions when adults change the subject, do not follow your mother when she carried food out back. When you grow up in a place like that, you learn that silence is not emptiness, it is a tool. The first time I saw my sister clearly, I was 6. The shed door was cracked open, and I slipped inside, thinking I would be scolded only for trespassing. My sister sat on the ground with her knees hugged to her chest, and when she looked up, all the light in the room seemed to shift. Her normal eyes were tired and human, but that crease on her forehead held something else. It was not always open, but I could tell it was there, like a lid that could lift when it wanted. Even closed, it felt like it watched. My sister did not smile at me then. She only raised a finger to her lips, not as a threat, but as a warning, like silence was the only thing keeping both of us alive. I remember backing out slowly, and the shed smelling colder when I left than when I entered. When I was 10, my father decided the eye had to be sealed. He said it was to protect the family, to stop talk, to keep me from being cursed by association. He did not call it cruelty, he called it prevention. He used thick thread and a needle meant for leather. My mother held my sister down while my father stitched skin the way he would stitch a torn tarp. My sister did not scream, but her body shook with controlled breath, and the eye, when it opened for a moment, stared at him like a ledger recording a debt. The wound became infected within days. The stitches rotted, fluid leaked, and the smell crept through the yard like something alive. Neighbors came by with concerned faces, but none came close enough to help. That was the first time I noticed how fear spreads through a town. It does not scream, it whispers, it makes people stand at a distance and call it wisdom. It convinces ordinary people that doing nothing is the same as doing right. Around that time I began waking at night to a faint scraping sound. It came from the back of the house, from the direction of the shed. It never sounded violent, only consistent, like nails brushed lightly over wood, as if someone was testing whether a door might someday give. When I was 13, my mother finally told me the truth. She told me in the dark after my father had fallen asleep, her voice small and brittle. She described the sack, the riverbank, the midwife's warning, and the years my sister lived behind our house like a shameful secret. Something broke in me that night. I marched into my father's room and shouted that my sister was a person, that she was born different but still alive, still ours. My father reached for his stick and swung with the same reflex he used on stray dogs and bad crops. The blow never landed on me. My sister stepped between us, her face pale, blood still sometimes leaking from the ruined wound on her forehead. She stood straight, as if she had been waiting her whole life for the chance to place her body in the path of harm on purpose. My father froze when he realized she was choosing me. He stared at her like she had become something new, not more human but more dangerous because she could now decide. He lowered the stick and walked out, saying nothing, and my mother sat down on the floor and cried until sunrise. After that, my sister was allowed inside the house. She sat at the far end of the table, quiet, careful, eating as if any sudden movement might revoke the privilege. My mother began placing extra food in her bowl, but always in a quick motion, like kindness was something that should not be witnessed. I brought home my books and taught her what I could. She learned letters and numbers at a speed that unsettled me because it did not feel like learning, it felt like recalling. She could read a page once and remember it, as if her mind had been waiting in the dark for someone to unlock it. At night I sometimes woke and found her sitting under the porch light, reading again and again. When she finished, she did not go to bed immediately. She looked out into the yard, into the black beyond the fence, and her face carried the quiet focus of someone listening for a sound only she could hear. My father began speaking to her in small ways. He asked her to pass something, to bring him a coat, to close a door. Each request sounded ordinary, but my sister reacted like the words were heavy, like being addressed as a person hurt more than being ignored. One night she took me behind the house to the old oak that stood near the edge of our property. The town called it a hanging tree, though no one could ever confirm whether that was true. My sister told me she sometimes felt the river watching her, not like water but like something beneath water. She said she was not afraid of dying, she was afraid that dying would not be the end. She said the town's fear had shaped her, and shapes do not disappear easily. She said, almost casually, that if the town ever needed her for something, they would come and they would not ask. I laughed then, trying to lighten the air because I was still young enough to believe laughter could change fate. I promised her I would take her away someday, to a place where nobody knew about the shed or the scar on her forehead. She smiled, and for a moment she looked almost peaceful, until the wind rose and carried the faintest whisper of the river into our yard. When I left for school the next year, I carried that promise like a talisman. I believed leaving was the first step towards saving her. I did not know leaving was also the first step in a plan that had been unfolding for longer than my life. High school in the city felt like a different planet. The halls smelled like bleach, the floors shined, people talked about college and careers like they were guarantees. For a while, I went days without thinking about the shed, and when I did think about it, the memories felt smaller, like old photographs. Then I found a letter in my desk. It was written in neat handwriting, careful and controlled, and it unsettled me because it did not feel like a teenager's impulsive note. Friends grinned and told me the girl who wrote it came from one of the richest families in the county. They described her house on the far side of town, set back behind gates, near the wide river that fed into ours. They described her father as powerful, the kind of man who sat on boards and attended private dinners. They described her mother as connected, the kind of woman who smiled at the right people and never worried about consequences. I met the girl a few times at school. She was polite and composed, but there was something in her eyes that looked tired, like she had been sick for a long time and learned to hide it. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she pressed her fingers between her eyebrows as if something ached there. I told my sister about the letter during summer break. My sister listened, then asked questions that felt too precise, like she was mapping a route. She asked about the girl's health, about whether the house was near water, about whether the family owned livestock, about whether the girl ever complained of feeling watched. I told myself my sister was only curious. But when she asked those things, the crease on her forehead seemed to deepen, as if the skin itself listened. That was the first time I wondered whether the third eye had never truly closed, only learned to wait. That summer, my sister and I went to the river like we did when we were younger. She caught crabs and laughed, and for a few minutes she looked like a normal older sister, a person with a future. Then she went quiet and stared into the water as if it were a mirror. I asked what she was looking at. She said she was only thinking, but her hand tightened around mine like she was afraid I might slip and be taken. I did not realize then that she was not afraid of the river's depth, she was afraid of its memory. Back at school, rumors spread that the girl had become seriously ill. They said she suffered sudden pain, that her body weakened, that doctors could not find a cause. They also said she started waking at night screaming that someone stood in her room and watched her without blinking. When my teacher pulled me aside during study hall and handed me the phone, I assumed it was a family emergency. It was, but not the kind emergencies prepare you for. A man identified himself as law enforcement and asked me questions about my sister, whether she seemed depressed, whether she had talked about harming herself. He told me her body had been pulled from the river back home. He told me she had been in the water for days. He told me the identifying feature was the scar at her forehead, because faces change in water but scars remain. I dropped the phone and stood in the hallway unable to breathe. All I could picture was my sister's hand holding mine by the river, her grip tight with warning. I remembered my promise, and it felt suddenly childish, like a story told to keep someone calm before something inevitable happened. When I returned home, the town looked the same, but it felt staged, like a set after the actors had left. People spoke softly, avoided my eyes, and said the same rehearsed phrases about tragedy. No one talked about the days my sister was missing, or where she had been, or why she had been near the water. At the morgue, the smell hit me like a wall. My sister's body was swollen, her skin gray, and her forehead scar looked larger than I remembered. The place where the third eye had been was not damaged by water, it was empty in a way that suggested intent, like someone had removed something they valued. The officer told me no procedure had been done by authorities. He said no one had reported missing body parts because the town focused on the death, not the detail. That was when I understood the most frightening thing about collective grief: it can be guided away from truth with very little effort. The funeral was small. Many neighbors stayed away, and those who came kept their condolences brief, as if lingering near my sister invited contamination. I watched them stand close enough to show respect, but far enough to escape responsibility, and I felt something in me harden. Then the rich girl arrived. She stepped into the room with pale skin and clear eyes, healthier than the rumors had described. She bowed her head before my sister's coffin for a long time, and when she looked up, her expression carried a sadness that felt practiced. She told me my sister had been her tutor. She told me my sister had helped her through a difficult period, and she spoke about her as if she were a person worthy of respect. Hearing that respect from someone outside our town made my stomach twist, because it was too late to matter. After the funeral, she stayed behind to help tidy up. She said carefully that she wished she could have done more when my sister disappeared. She explained that she had been sick, bedridden, and her parents had insisted she not get involved. As we walked outside, she admitted that her illness had been strange, not like anything doctors could explain. She said her parents had eventually brought in someone who claimed to understand spiritual affliction, someone who performed a ritual in the house. She said she improved afterward, but the nightmares began, and in those nightmares she saw an eye opening between her eyebrows. She said it like she was describing weather, as if detachment kept panic under control. I nodded and listened, while inside my mind the river whispered, and my sister's warning echoed. The girl offered to invite me to her home in the city, to meet her parents, to talk in a calmer setting. I accepted, even though every instinct told me not to. I told myself I needed answers, and answers lived where power lived. I did not admit that some part of me also wanted to stand in front of the people who might have used my sister and look them in the eye. The house sat behind tall gates and quiet cameras. Everything about it was smooth, clean, designed to leave no marks. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, the kind used in hospitals, and it made food aroma seem thin and distant. Her parents greeted me with warmth that never reached their eyes. They spoke about my future, about school, about how my sister had cared for me. They treated my sister's death like a sad inconvenience that could be compensated with money, favors, connections. I noticed a small glass jar on a shelf behind them. It held something gray that shimmered when light touched it, like ash mixed with crushed glass. No one acknowledged the jar, but the mother's eyes flicked toward it when she spoke, as if checking that it remained undisturbed. Dinner was impressive. The food looked perfect, arranged with intention, served with smiles. But the table was strangely quiet, because no utensils clinked against plates, and no one seemed to chew with ordinary human messiness. It felt like a performance designed to convince me I was safe. It also felt like a test, as if they were watching whether I noticed the absence of normal sounds. People who have nothing to hide do not rehearse comfort so carefully. I excused myself and stepped into the kitchen, hoping to steady my thoughts. A long mirror hung on a wall where it did not belong, reflecting a hallway that led to a darker set of stairs. In the mirror, for a brief moment, I saw my own face, and behind it, a vertical shape like a person standing too close. I turned around quickly. No one was there, and the kitchen remained empty and spotless. But I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and I knew I had not imagined the pressure of being watched. When I returned to the table, a glass had been poured for me. I drank because refusing felt dangerous, because refusing might reveal fear, and fear was what these people understood best. Within minutes, my limbs felt heavy, and my vision blurred as if the room were sinking into water. I tried to stand, but the floor tilted. The father's expression did not change, and the mother's smile remained polite. The girl watched me with an intensity that felt almost hungry, and then darkness took me. I woke in a room lit red, like light filtered through skin. My wrists were tied, the rope tight enough to burn. The smell in the room was not disinfectant. It was metallic, like old blood washed but not fully removed. The father stood in front of me, calm, as if he were about to explain a contract. The mother stood beside him, hands folded, eyes bright with a careful interest. The girl stood slightly behind them, her face composed, but her gaze fixed on my forehead. They did not confess everything at once. They gave me pieces, as if feeding information slowly made it easier to accept. They explained the girl's illness, the kind that did not show up in scans because it was not flesh that was failing, it was something deeper. They said she had been followed by something that watched her at night. They said it fed on attention, on fear, on the feeling of being observed. They said the ritualist they hired could not remove it, only redirect it, and redirecting required a vessel. They said my sister was that vessel. They spoke her name like they were naming a tool. They said she was born open, born with a crack, and cracks can be widened and used. They said they had known about our town for years. They said the river near us had a history, people disappearing, bodies found days later, families too frightened to ask questions. They said places like that develop openings, thin spots in the world, and occasionally a child is born carrying that thinness on their skin. They said the third eye was not a gift, it was access. They said with access you can move things that should not be moved. They said my sister's suffering in that shed had made her stable, because stability comes from repetition, and she had repeated fear every day of her life. As they spoke, I felt the room thicken, like air turning to damp cloth. The girl took a slow step forward, and her pupils looked slightly wrong, faintly stretched, like a horizontal line beneath the iris. The mother's gaze moved to my forehead again, measuring, calculating. That was when I felt it, a shift like a door opening behind me. The red light flickered, and I heard a quiet breath that was not mine. The father stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening with a fear he could not disguise. Something stood between me and them. I did not see my sister in the way you see a person. I felt her as pressure, as presence, as attention focused in a single direction with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. The girl froze, her mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again when no words came. Her hands trembled, and for the first time she looked like someone who remembered what it meant to be sick and powerless. The father's calm cracked, and he took a step back without meaning to. The ropes around my wrist loosened. Not because I grew stronger, but because something unseen tugged at the knots with quiet precision. I pulled free, grabbed the nearest object that could be used as a weapon, and ran. I ran through hallways that smelled too clean. I ran past that mirror, and in it I saw a second face overlapping my own for an instant, pale and familiar, eyes wide with a tired sadness. I ran outside into cold air, and only then did I realize my shirt was damp with something that smelled faintly metallic. I flagged down a ride, and the driver stared at me like I was dangerous. I gave him an address and held the object in my hand in a way that made him understand I would not accept refusal. As we drove, I felt a pressure inside my skull, like someone leaning close to listen through my ears. I returned to my hometown that night because the river was the only place that felt honest. Rain began again as if the weather itself remembered what had happened before. I climbed the hill behind the cemetery with mud clinging to my shoes, lightning flashing just enough to show gravestones like teeth. I found my sister's grave and knelt. I did not cry the way I expected to because grief had been replaced by something sharper. I started digging with my hands, then with a tool, scraping through wet earth until my fingers bled. When the coffin lid appeared, the smell rose, thick and sweet and raw. I pried it open with shaking arms, and I saw what remained of my sister. Her body had begun to collapse into itself, but her eyes were still there, intact, staring upward through decay. I understood then that someone had taken what they needed from her and left the rest. They had removed the third eye, but they had not removed her attention. Attention, once sharpened by years of fear, does not vanish when flesh dies. I touched one of her remaining eyes. A cold shock ran up my arm, then heat flooded my stomach and I collapsed into the mud. For a moment I could not breathe, then I heard a familiar presence settle inside my mind, quiet, heavy, awake. After that, I was no longer alone inside my own body. I returned to the city not as a victim seeking justice, but as someone carrying an inheritance I did not want. I broke into the rich family's home days later, because I knew they kept records, and people like them do not rely on faith without documentation. I found a leather-bound notebook locked in a drawer. It was not filled with dramatic spells or theatrical symbols. It read like procedures, like instructions for moving pressure from one vessel to another, with notes about failure rates and stability. It described my sister as a successful transfer. It described her as a long-term container, a living filter for something that could not be fully removed. It described the final requirement, the need to complete the system by adding another compatible vessel, someone genetically close, someone who carried the same thinness in the blood. Me. At first I told myself I would take the notebook to police. Then I imagined how the father would smile in court, how the mother would cry convincingly, how the girl would sit pale and fragile, a perfect victim again. I imagined a judge hearing talk of rivers and eyes and ritual, and deciding it sounded like grief, not evidence. I began to understand why the town had chosen silence for so long. Silence is safer than being ridiculed, silence is safer than being punished for speaking. Silence is also how evil becomes ordinary. The presence inside me began to change the way I saw people. In crowds, I noticed who avoided eye contact and who stared too long. I noticed who spoke kindly but moved away from certain topics, and who smiled while thinking about what they could get. Some nights, I woke sweating with my hands clenched and I did not remember what I had dreamed. But I remembered the feeling, hunger not for food but for something harder to name. It was as if my sister's attention, once forced to watch suffering in silence, now demanded the world watch back. I tried to keep my life normal. I attended class, I went to work, I smiled at friends. But every time someone looked at me too long, I felt a tightening behind my eyes, like a lid preparing to open. Small things started happening around me. A light bulb would burst when I walked into a room. A stranger would trip on nothing and fall hard enough to bleed, then stare at me with confusion and fear. I told myself it was coincidence. Then I passed a man outside a bus station, a man who grabbed a woman's wrist too tightly, who hissed at her when she tried to pull away. The presence inside me leaned forward in my skull, and the man stopped mid-motion as if something had clamped his lungs. He released her without understanding why. He stumbled backward, pale, sweating, eyes wide as if he had seen something that did not belong in daylight. The woman ran, and I stood frozen, realizing I had done nothing, and yet something had moved through me anyway. That was the beginning of my moral collapse, not a dramatic choice but a quiet surrender. I told myself I was preventing harm, I told myself it was balance. I told myself my sister deserved to be more than a victim. The presence did not argue. It only waited, patient and watchful, like it had waited in the shed, like it had waited in the river. And each time I accepted what happened, the line between my will and hers grew thinner. I learned where the rich family's power came from. Not just money, but a network of people who owed them favors, teachers, officers, doctors, local officials who had been paid to look away. My sister had not been taken only by 3 people in a house. She had been taken by a system that made her disappearance convenient. I visited my hometown without announcing myself. I walked through streets where people still avoided the shed, even though it was empty now. Neighbors greeted me with cautious politeness, eyes flicking toward my forehead, as if they expected to see something open there. An old man at the general store told me my sister's death had been a tragedy, and his voice carried the relief of someone repeating a line that absolved him. He asked if I was doing well, then quickly added that he had always felt sorry for my sister. He did not say he had ever done anything to help, because in a town like that, feeling sorry is considered a sufficient form of goodness. That night I sat by the river alone. Water moved slowly, black and thick, reflecting no stars. I felt the presence inside me tilt toward it, like a person leaning close to a familiar window. The river did not whisper in words. It whispered in sensations, in reminders, in the sense that something old and patient had watched the town for generations. I realized the river did not create the evil, it only held it like a basin holding dirty water until someone finally drinks. I returned to the city with the notebook, and with the understanding that the rich family was only one branch of a larger shape. They had hired a ritualist, but the notebook suggested other names, other towns, other vessels that failed. It hinted at a market, not for money but for access, for cracks in the world that could be used by those desperate enough. I considered destroying the notebook. Then I imagined the girl's parents finding another vessel, someone else's sister, someone else's mistake. I told myself keeping the notebook gave me leverage, and maybe it did, but it also kept the door open. The girl tried to contact me after that night. She left messages that sounded worried, even caring, but her words carried a careful distance, like she was reciting a script written by someone older. She said she hoped I was safe, she said she wanted to explain, she said she missed the calm my sister brought her. I did not respond. I could not decide whether she was a victim in her own way, or a participant who learned to enjoy being protected by someone else's suffering. Some people survive by sacrificing others, and still convince themselves they are innocent because they did not hold the knife. Weeks passed, and the presence inside me grew more distinct. It did not speak in sentences. It spoke in impulses, in images, in the sensation of being pulled toward certain people, certain places. I started noticing the worst kind of people, not the loud ones but the quiet ones who smiled while they arranged harm. A supervisor who stole wages, a landlord who threatened tenants, a man who followed girls too young to understand why they felt uneasy. Each time I saw one, the pressure behind my eyes increased, and the world seemed to narrow into a single point of attention. I began to fear myself more than them, because I could feel how easy it was to justify. Because the presence inside me was not a demon with horns, it was my sister's hunger to matter, to be seen, to stop being the one trapped behind walls. The town had erased her while she lived. Now, through me she could erase others, and the temptation felt like justice when it was really just power. One night I stood in a bathroom mirror and studied my forehead. In certain light, I could see a faint vertical line between my eyebrows, a mark that had not been there before, or maybe had been too subtle for me to notice. When I leaned closer, the line seemed deeper, as if the skin was thinning. I backed away, heart pounding, and the presence inside me settled like a hand on the back of my thoughts. It felt almost gentle, almost protective. That was what frightened me most, because cruelty wrapped in gentleness is how people accept the unacceptable. I tried to go to sleep, but the feeling of being watched filled the room. Not from outside, but from within, like a second set of eyes had opened behind my own. I understood then that the rich family had not only taken my sister, they had also given me a path, a role, a shape that fit too well. They had turned grief into a mechanism. They had turned a town's fear into a tool. And now that tool lived inside me, learning, adapting, waiting for the next opportunity. I wish I could say I chose a clean ending. I wish I could say I exposed them, saved others, closed the door. But the truth is heavier and quieter. Some nights I walk past the river in the city and feel it pull at me, even though it is not my hometown's river. Water is water, and memory travels through it in ways we do not understand. I feel the presence inside me lean toward it, listening for something that calls back. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window late at night, I hesitate before meeting my own eyes, because I am no longer certain whether I am the one looking out, or whether something that has waited a long time is finally looking in.